Prelude 13 completely changed how virtues work in an effort to create more diverse builds, and it kind of worked? We no longer have the hard courage meta of Prelude's 12, but there are still some pretty big issues. So, of course, I'm going to talk about it while making the biggest damage numbers I can, and this is nowhere near the highest number. Just like in Prelude's 12, any virtue can be good in P13, but your choices for making that happen are a lot more limited now that each weapon type is aligned to a single virtue. Buildcraft basically comes down to deciding whether you want to favor one of your pack's arcanics or invest in your weapon's damage. If you choose a packed arcanic, you have to choose a weapon attuned to that virtue because you miss out on a ton of damage if you don't meet a weapon's virtue requirement. While it is nice that weapons no longer do less damage when you're below the requirement like they did in Prelude's 12, the damage from virtue scaling is so significant that losing it is absolutely still a punishment. So, if you want to use a specific weapon, then that weapon determines how you allocate your virtues, which in turn determines which packed arcanics your build focuses on. Or, if you focus on a packed arcanic, that determines which weapons you can use. This means that while there is more variety in endgame builds in Prelude's 13 compared to Prelude's 12, there is much less player agency in creating those builds, which just isn't as fun. So, how could this get better? I don't think prisms are the problem here. I'm able to fine-tune my virtue allocations through talismans and pact upgrades, and in that regard, I only feel limited by the inability to save upgrades to my loadout. We've heard that pact upgrade trees are going to be reworked at some point, and I hope that comes soon, because right now it's a pain to reset your pact every time you want to change builds. In fact, I think the biggest advantage of having a wild pact is not the added strength of being able to max out all your upgrades, but just the convenience of never needing to reset them. If we had some other way to get the virtue points from pact upgrades and were able to save those points to our loadouts, I think that would go a long way towards making prisms feel more fun to build with. But I think we also need to get rid of virtue requirements and attunement normalization. There just isn't any reason to punish players for not meeting a requirement. If you have a low value in a weapon's attuned virtue, that will already result in less damage, and there's plenty of incentive to invest more points in that virtue to get more damage. Removing virtue requirements would also let us build weapons like Bog and Myrtle or Maestro with either of the virtues they are attuned to, which would be so good for build variety. Even the lowered dual requirements on weapons like Juniper and Basker's Rest still limit the potential combinations by requiring investment in both attunements. And even when those combinations can be made, your pact build is still fully mandated by your chosen weapons. I understand that DE wanted to make the virtues feel a bit like classes, but that isn't what happened. My favorite P13 Siren build uses Juniper with just enough grace to meet the requirement and everything else all in on Spirit. It's fast and fun and in no way makes me feel like a mage archetype just because I'm using Spirit. I do very much feel like a glass cannon, but that's because of the health scaling and still doesn't make me feel like a mage. I can see an argument for the most lethal ranged weapons being tied to builds with less health and melee weapons being tied to builds with more health, but that's not what we have. If health were tied to weapon range and lethality, then bows would have the least health, magic weapons and flyblades should be at the midpoint, and short blades would have max health along with all other melee weapons. This would at least make the grip type attunement normalization make sense, but it would still leave us in this place where either your equipment determines your arcanics or your arcanics determine your equipment. And even that might make sense if the arcanics had been designed with this balance in mind, but it is just very clear that they were not. If DE really wants to double down on virtues as class-like archetypes, then almost every pact in Soulframe needs a rework. But why? What does the game gain through adopting this RPG trope? Yes, other games do have classes and limit your build options based on what class you pick, but just because other games do it doesn't mean every game has to. Part of what I loved about Soulframe and P12 was that it didn't follow the same old patterns. The potential for creativity and putting together unique weapon and pact combinations was so fun. I can't even count how many dex-based archers I've played in other fantasy games, and Soulframe was such a delightful breath of fresh air when it finally let me do something new. So, 2 months after my first impressions of P13, I'm still very disappointed in the decision to make all weapons within each grip type require the same virtue. And while dual virtue weapons do help, they aren't going to solve the problem as long as those requirements force that normalized investment. We don't need classes in Soulframe because we have pacts. I don't want to feel like a rogue or a mage or a fighter. I want to feel like an envoy wielding a pact. Thankfully, the game is still in development, so I really hope future updates reclaim some of the freedom we lost in P13. But okay, enough of that. I promised you big numbers, so let's get to some shenanigans. In order to get the highest damage output possible in P13, I needed some squad buffs, so Cammy brought Orengal to boost my Grace with the Howl, and Springroll brought Oshelda for Bestone. I used Tethrin once again because Fellust is still the best DPS Arcanic in Soulframe, and I used my Avex on a Courage build because I needed 42 Courage to get all 7 charges for Fellust. I used both Courage and Grace Virtue Potions to boost my damage even further, plus Cammy used a Grace build and a Grace Potion for a stronger Howl, and Springroll used a Courage build and a Courage Potion for a stronger Bestone. I should note here that if I were the one taking the shot and casting Bestone, it would be better for me to use Grace, since the damage you get from Grace multipliers is stronger than the damage you get from Bestone's Arcanic scaling. In fact, this is true for any pact that can make enemies vulnerable to stealth multipliers. Siren, Oshelda, and Garenrud all do more damage with all Arcanics on full Grace builds even when using Courage or Spirit Arcanics. But since I'm the one taking the shot, I need the Grace, which I'm primarily getting through my Virtue Potion and Cammy's Howl, so Springroll can use Courage to boost his Bestone's Break multiplier. Of course, my Avex has Quicksilver on it for the Headshot multiplier, and I managed to activate Alka's Breath, get all 6 stacks of my Fellust buff, and take my 7th shot within 20 seconds so that I could benefit from the damage boost from Voided. I took my headshot on a Bestoned enemy and got a truly delightful number that outdid my P12 best. But wait, there's more. While testing build combos, I noticed something strange was going on with the rat totems that deal damage to a nearby enemy. If both the enemy I hit and the enemy the rat totem hit were frozen by Bestone, then the rat damage proc became quite extraordinary. It took us a while to figure out what was going on here, because if the 2 Bestoned enemies were also the last enemies in the group, then the damage dealt to the one I shot would get capped in the same way that damage dealt to self-destructing enemies gets capped, even though the lightning strike animation didn't play and the enemy hit by the rat should have been the last one to die. But once we eliminated that variable, the multiplier was pretty consistent, so it seems like the rat totem is somehow double dipping on the stealth multipliers. This is certainly a bug, but having figured it out, I just had to know how high we could get that number. So here is my best shot in P13 hitting 100,711 damage, and the rat totem dealt 275,095 damage to a nearby foe. Now let's see how quickly DE hotfixes it. Future Sarah here. Steve just told us the P14 will arrive hopefully this week, so I hurried to get this video out as quickly as possible. I still love Soulframe despite its virtue issues, and absolutely trust in DE's track record of taking feedback and coming up with creative solutions, so I am very excited to check out what the new update has in store for us. But what do you think? Are virtues or requirements going to change? How long will the rat totem stay bugged? Place your bets in the comments, and until next time, happy hunting!